So I'll start to talk about this body of work here. That the title of this body of work is Fragile Land. And I started to focus on flowers, the all endangered flowers from Israel. For a long time I was working with botanical species and the relationship that they have often now sort of a nationalistic discourse were invested in them and sometimes indoctrinated into a particular way of thinking. So the flowers that there's something very innocent about them becoming enriched by a sort of a national pathos. And one of the things that interests me about Israel, and it started with a thought about, I was actually approached by an institute in Israel called Shenka, and they start to work with Polaroid, and they asked me if I'll be interested to do a project with the Polaroids. And when I thought about Polaroid, I thought about the endangered flowers and about the relationship that exists between flowers that are on the verge of extinction and the Polaroid as a medium, an analog medium, that there is always a unique, a one-off, and the points that the two of them are meeting, and the two of them are at the stage of instability, and the instability of the subject and the medium together in some sort of a meltdown. And then this led to me starting to think about the endangered flower and the whole narrative that's surrounding them, which for me it's kind of useful as a context when I start to make a body of work. And what happened with those flowers, that all my generation are very familiar with them. We almost know them by heart because it was so important it was part of the national ethos. It started in the early 1920s. So when the Zionist movement was emerging, there was a real encouragement to become familiar with the flower. And there was a couple that arrived from the Ukraine, Ruveni their name was, and they started a huge project to give biblical names, Hebrew names, to all the flowers. So there was a program of translating from Latin into Hebrew and claiming those flowers by connecting them to the Bible and to the land, claiming them as the flowers of Israel. And by defining them as the flowers of Israel, there was also a denial that these flowers are actually also growing in Lebanon or in Jordan, that the original flower, they became national flowers, defining by sort of arbitrary lines that was a kind of pencil around the territory. And what started to happen, part of this project was also to go and encourage people to go and uproot flowers. And the act of uprooting flowers is also a way to be rooted to the land. And this wasn't just a Zionist activity. This happened all around the Western world and in Europe from the 19th century as kind of nationalism was rising. It's start to see all these books that identifying flower books that are usually associated with a nation. So Hungary got one and Germany got one. It was part of this this ethos and also part of a romantic spirit. So this flower became, after a while, because it became such an intensive pastime, the flower became endangered. So then a new action came in the 70s. Posters arrived, appeared in Israel, and there was the legislation and heavy punishment to everyone who was going to pick those flowers. And the act of protecting the flower became an act of protecting the land. So it still plays a similar role. And when we were kids, there were a lot of card game with images of the flowers. So if you couldn't physically encounter them, the familiarity through images still maintain the same important and significant. I start to think about this, how, and it's very strange, how difficult it was for me to conceive that these flowers grow everywhere else, as if they were imprisoned by my ideas that they are the flowers of Israel. And a lot of them are growing around the border. So I started to think about this relationship and how can I capture them at a state of this sort of instability. And on the one level, keep this idea of the botanical rigor, almost a scientific rigor, and the same kind of be suggestive of something that is kind of poetic and very fragile. I started to look at the history of botanical drawing, and what I find that there was an interesting relationship between art history and botanical history. And actually in botanical drawing until the 15th century, botanical manifest, there were hardly any attention to drawings. The drawings are very schematic because science up to this point believes that important is in information rather than in images. But when you look at drawings around this period of Dürer's or Leonardo, you see that there is a very great proximity to the real flowers and beautiful poetic executions that are very lifelike. And one of the reasons was that all the painting around this time were religious painting, and actually the closer you come to the representation of the real flower, the closer you came to the divine creator. So there was a real incentive there, but for science there wasn't. And then all of a sudden the scientific discipline recognized this, and they start to implement, and the whole empirical observation, visual empirical observation, arrived to science from the art. This is something that I'm constantly interested in, the kind of the flux and the relationship between new technology and how they affect the production of images. And I'll talk about it in a minute. I just will finish this idea that start to happen to scientific drawing. So early botanical drawings, they are very much related to the drawing of Leonardo and Dürer. They are very poetic, and you see a particular flower that is depicted, and you can see the life and death elements within one flower. But slowly science started to drift away from it, because there is no interest in the individual flower. There is an interest in a specimen, in something that is generic, a flower that will represent the whole flower of its kind. So if it's a cyclamen, then you want not a particular cyclamen, but a cyclamen that is all cyclamen. So it started to be more and more removed from the specific. And what started to happen in many of the botanical drawings, they are as if the flower is being so alleviated or pulled away from its context. So we start with black background, a white background, and the specimen are floating. So if you see some of my picture of the cyclamen that are over there, I kind of took the tubers and I actually photograph it as if they're floating. So they are totally isolated from the kind of holistic surrounding. And I was interested in this because I looked at the cyclamen, and in my head I was seeing them almost as some sort of existential islands, that a group of flowers by coincidence are growing there together, and no one can leave. They're part of the same tuber, and one get hit and another stays there, and they sort of have to live in this floating entity. And what started to happen, and the reason I was interested in this, that I wanted to follow this sort of scientific approach where there is no context. So I'm thinking about, when I said I was looking at those flowers, the flowers of Israel, as if there is no broader context, that they're regional flowers, and actually they grow, they are related to the environment that they are in. By taking the black or the white background, I was able to create this separation, but not just create this separation, but also follow a certain rigor. So I started to photograph them in series. So I try to follow sort of a typological approach. So I take one flower and I do a series of them, and the rules are also always the same. So it's pseudo-scientific, and at the same time, the intervention with each flower becoming very unique. So I was trying to kind of give each flower its own identity, or each moment its identity, that is kind of bringing it to the poetic, and to keep some sort of tension between the scientific approach and the poetic approach. Now, the way I photograph them, so what happened in each one of these flowers, I shoot them with a palette. And when I shoot them, I try to capture them at a very particular state. It's a state of instability where they're still holding together, but they start to fall apart. And I'm interested in this moment because I'm trying to, photography as a medium is always relying on tangible object. You cannot photograph something that is not there. And what I'm really hoping all the time is to capture something that is not there. And to move on this threshold between the camera as a recording tool and the camera as a creating tool. So is the camera is recording the world or creating a world that is unattainable for us? And how can I photograph something that is not there? And by doing this, what I'm trying to do is to capture a moment in a kind of a very, the slither of the present, where something is holding together but already falling apart. When I was thinking about this moment, I was thinking and making all this work and looking at those black irises, I was thinking about the image of the burning bush, where Moses is standing in front of the burning bush that was on fire on one level, but never being consumed. and at the same time still rooted to the ground and very tangible, and about this kind of dual state of something that is hovering between the metaphysical and the physical state. So in all these photographs, it's an attempt to capture something that is simultaneously there and not. Something that we can never experience because it happened at such a speed. These photographs are taken at 100,000th of a second. At such a speed that without the technology, we have no idea if this moment ever occurred or not. And only if we believe in the technology, then they have any authority over truth. But not just as a physical entity, the attempt to capture this thing that is hovering between the physical and metaphysical happen in the physical state of the object, but also, as I mentioned, in relation to time. Because it's photographed at such an enormous speed, I imagine that this event happening in the fold of time. So if we're moving, we have a sense of linearity that we're moving through. There are all these events that are happening in little folds that we go through and we are unaware of. And all of a sudden, through technologies, I'm able to capture this moment and kind of bring them into consciousness. I'll talk about it a little bit more when I talk about the still life. Another thing that started to happen when I was working with these flowers is that I start to unfold other narratives that are connecting them into art history. So for example, these flowers, which are the Madonna lilies, they, and all the flowers, by the way, that I photographed, they are indigenous flowers, and they're flowers that there were no any genetic modification to them. So it was very much important to me that they are connected to, that the relationship they have to the land, to where they're coming from, is keep its kind of a indigenous purity. But what happened to the Madonna lilies is that in the 11th century, when the Crusades arrived to Israel, they started to take them away and bring them into Europe. So these flowers became the flowers of the Annunciation and appeared in any Renaissance painting. And the same happened to the black irises. In the 17th century, with the scientific revolution, where imperialism kind of take off and a lot of flowers start to come into Europe, like the tulips into Holland, these flowers start to appear in Jan Bruegel, the Elder painting. So the very early flower painting, all of a sudden, from the 17th century, all of a sudden black irises appearing that are also being migrated from the region of Israel or the Middle East and arriving into Europe. So all these kind of processes of migration is also part of this narrative. Another thing that I was trying to do in these photographs, so I mentioned the Polaroid. So behind you, there are Madonna lilies that were photographed with a Polaroid camera, which is an analog film, and you can see all the marks on them. These marks are imperfections that created through the chemistry of the Polaroid. So when I pull the Polaroid apart, I get all these marks which are totally uncontrollable. I buy the film, sometimes the film arrived to Europe from the United States and sometimes from Vienna, so maybe the film went through X-ray and the different temperature affecting them. And on the other end, there are these photographs, which are the digital photograph. Now, the way I photograph it is I capture the same moment simultaneously. So I have the gun with the bullet, and I have the flash that is freezing the event, and then I have the two cameras. And the way it works is the gun is connected to an electronic device that we can create a delay in milliseconds. So I'm trying to calculate, in principle, the distance of the gun from the flower and the time that will take the bullet to go from the gun to the flower, and then to put a delay so the camera can actually capture the moment right at the impact. And in order to do this, the best way is actually to freeze the image with the flashlight, not with the camera. So what I do is everything is in darkness and the cameras are open. So I have two cameras that are open, one with the Polaroid film and one with the digital film. And both of them are capturing exactly the same moment. But the strange thing for me is that each one is capturing a completely different image. Each one is capturing a different narrative of the same event, and each one is equally truthful. It's just that one is an analog and one is a digital. And in the analog, everything is much more visceral and a bit more sensual and soft. And in the digital, everything becomes almost inhumane. It becomes so crisp and so sharp and rich in information that the two of them are creating a real dichotomy. And for me, it's kind of bring this question, which I'm interested. So I mentioned before that how do I know that any of these moments happen? I have to rely on technology. Only if I believe in the technologies that made them, then this is a true moment, but we don't have any means to assess it ourselves. We rely on the bridging of the technology. In the same way as the analog and the digital, each one is capturing a different narrative, and each one is equally truthful. And the question is where truth is lying, where it's really resting. I'm interested in this because being brought up in Israel, I was brought up with a particular historical narrative that as a child I believed it to be absolutely true. And as a result of it, it was impossible for me to digest any other possible narratives. And only when I moved to London and I changed my vantage point, I started to kind of realize that there are all these narratives that are parallel to each other, and actually any narrative, if you're part of, making sense and becoming equally truthful. And this whole idea of ability to shift and to be able to perceive, or as soon as you start to develop doubt, then there can be a possibility for empathy or understanding or kind of broadening the horizon. And a lot of my work is trying to explore where truth is lying. How do I know that a moment is more truthful than another? How do I take a position? How do I build my moral stand in the world, which is something that I always try. And in order to do this, I need to believe that something is true and where truth is lying. And the medium of photography is particularly interesting for this because photography is still holding an authority over truth. As an historical document in court, a photograph is always relying on an object that was in front of the camera. I cannot photograph something that was not there. So this sort of relationship and parallel narratives that are occurring because of the technology is a major interest. I'll just jump because I don't want to over-elaborate, and I'm already kind of talking quite a bit. I just mentioned a few words about the still life, which are the three works that relating to Zurbaran painting, and then there are three works that relating here to a Chardin painting, and then there is a whole room that relating to the Morandis painting. And they're very much related to this work. So there are similarities. I mean, the works were created, it's quite unusual for me to work on two bodies of work more or less coinciding with each other. But before I'll start to kind of talk about my motivation to start this body of work, I would like to go to something that I mentioned over there. So these works, all this group of work are relating to Old Master's work. And what is important for me is, although they relate to Old Master, I don't see them at all as derivative of the Old Master's work, because what I'm trying to capture is moments that the Old Master could not even comprehend, because this reality did not exist. It only became available because technology now allowing me to capture something that didn't exist before. I mean, kind of one of the images that I have in mind, and I often think about the 17th century, which is the scientific revolution, where the lenses were invented. And for the first time, Galileo can look into the sky, and people like Leeuwenhoek or Hooke can look through the microscope and see organisms that were unattainable before. And people didn't know how to deal with these things because they believe that in the creation of God, where everything was in terms of more or less in related proportion to us, and all of a sudden there is this whole world that being discovered through the microscope. So this crisis of why this was done, what was the intention of God behind it, but also people have to learn to look in a different way. So when Leeuwenhoek was looking through human sperm for the first time, he was expecting to see little people. He couldn't comprehend, and it takes time. And, today it's impossible for us to digest it because the moment we saw and we know what a sperm looked like, we can never go back, So, but we cannot see it without the mediation of the lens. So technology we're allowing to expand on reality. And it's a reality that it's a question if it existed before we saw it. So is reality becoming is becoming through consciousness or through a phenomena that are existing in the world, and how do we know these barriers? So what interests me is that the pictorial language of all this work is definitely connected to Old Masters, and I feel that all my foundation to any image that I create, to the design of the lens and the camera, is coming from the Renaissance. Even the format, the rectangular format of the frame, all these things were said, the golden triangle, it was all sent there. So everything that I do cannot escape what was done in the Renaissance and since then till now. But the moment that I try to capture is moments that did not exist. And so this kind of thought, in the same way as the 17th century, the lenses start to affect the way Vermeer was painting. I mean, all the painters start to shift completely because technology allowed them. And then the 19th century, in the Industrial Revolution, photography was invented. So there was another major shift, and painting changed dramatically again. And all of a sudden, the chemistries that allow the optical image that were already created in the 17th century to be fixed and to resist the passage of time. And now we're in the 21st century, and it's the digital revolution. And again, a dramatic shift. And this whole idea of time and space are being compressed and everything becoming dematerialized. I mentioned earlier before, I kind of feel that we are living in a period now that we're moving from body to consciousness. Kind of everything is losing its materiality. It's in the cloud. It's kind of information is passing almost as close to the speed of light because it has no materiality to it. So, you know, with the email or the information, everything is just at a speed that it's impossible to us to comprehend at all. So anyway, so I just talk a little bit about this, but historically, the reason I was attracted to all this work was that, you know, I live in Britain, and there are major crises at the moment, and identity crisis, and this kind of fundamental question of what is Europe. And when I go to the National Gallery in London, it's very clear to me what is Europe, because it seems that the history is so founded and grounded there, and it's not even divided to nation, it's just art history, and the Zubran, and then and I look at the Leonardo or the La Francesca or anything that is there, it just feels that it was always there and it will always be there. And so what I was thinking about is all this kind of junction where another possibility could have occurred and didn't occur. And I started to look at them, and I thought, I'll pick certain moment, iconic moment from European history, like the Zubran, which is one of my favorite paintings at the National Gallery. And I started to look at the objects of Zubran using those cups, and it's the moment where porcelain is started to be introduced to Europe, or Chardin started to use this vase, and it's objects that they were using time after time, so they appear in many of the paintings, and these vases are coming from China, so it's all sort of exchange that are start to happen, and start opening European border or changing European perception. And the same with the Morandi pieces. And then what I was trying to do in each one of them is to create a moment where I destabilize them. So I made the object out of porcelain, and the objects were made for the painting, so not for an image of what this vase actually looked like, but how it looks in the painting. So very slowly working on the patina of it and kind of creating the proportion, so it's very much related to how it appears in the painting. And then I every time destabilize it and try to capture it at different phases where it's, again, frozen in some sort of possible present that never lasts. So they are all in a stage of transition. In the Morandi, I kind of elaborate on it a little bit more. And what I start to do is to create a lot of objects of each one. So Morandi was working almost like I see it as musical variation. He take the same object and he keep using them, and every time through a different composition, through a different arrangement, a new possibility is created. So I kind of elaborated on this, and for example, the bottles that he was using, I created 30 or 40 of them, and they're identical, and the whole set was identical. So I was able to take one bottle and put another as if there was a cloning, almost a genetic cloning. So they all become the same thing. They're different objects, but each one can be substituted for another. And when I start to photograph them, so sometimes I destroy one thing and I leave it there, and I thought about it as sort of an archaeological relic. And then I capture the next object in its ultimate presence, the moment of disintegration. And then there are some objects that I kind of thought about them as representing the future because they are untouched. So the whole series of the Morandis are about these multiple times that are coexisting in a single photograph. And maybe I'll stop here. I can talk more and more. So I think that I said if you just want to ask any question, maybe quickly, and then yes.
What was the frame rate that you had to use to get that picture?
So these were done at 2,500 frames per second. And when I do, and these were done in a sequence, many of the Chardins, the flowers, are a single shot, and then I work with a very fast flash that go up to 100,000 of a second. But I usually at about 80, I mean, it depends, because there is a trade-off, because the quicker it is, the less power I get of it. So it depends how much power of light I need in relation to the speed, but it's very, very fast. Yeah.
Do the bullets show in any of these pieces?
In most of them it doesn't. If it does, sometimes we removed it. But in most of them it's also the angles that kind of they tend to disappear. But sometimes I captured the exact moment of impact, and then so I took the liberty when necessary to. I mean, it's a big question because I want these images. I mean, I'm trying to explore the relationship between the camera as a recording and documenting tool, because this whole question about truth is very relevant to the work that I'm trying, or in evidence, where truth is lying. But everything involves some sort of manipulation. The very first act of me putting a flower and a camera in front and framing it, it's already so. So I take some liberties, and it's a question. Of course, it's a subjective a question, ethical question of what sort of liberties, where it's still in line with my integrity and my intention. So I just feel sometimes if the bullet was in the one that the bullet is there, if I don't remove it, it becomes such a distraction that it's kind of take from. So it's this sort of trade-off sometimes. Yes.
So are these three separate vases that are
two in a sequence and one is not.
Yeah. So the fruit is a little bit different between them, so.
Yeah.
And what do you actually print on?
I work with different materials, but they are different papers. But these get this depth because it has a plexi face mounting to it.
So it's paper mounted on plexi?
Yeah, aluminum and plexi sandwich. And sometimes I just use different laminates, so there is no plexi. The pen. But
In the black iris, it seems like there's smoke coming up.
Yeah.
How is that? What's going on?
with liquid nitrogen. So they were frozen, and that's why they start to crack as well. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So much.
Okay.